Okay, we look like we've stabilized, so I think we'll kick off. So welcome everyone to the first of four sessions where we're going to be doing retrospectives on the MHHS CIT lifecycle. These sessions are intended for industry participants yourselves to reflect on what went well, what didn't go so well, what could be done differently for future programs of this type, presumably in this industry. The sessions are going to be recorded. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm just going to set the scene and talk about how we're going to structure the sessions, and then we'll kick off. So obviously the program recognises the value of capturing lessons learned from the delivery of the CIT journey, but the program also has a responsibility to document these insights and support in the planning and delivery of future industry programs of a similar nature. The program will also be conducting its own internal retrospective, and this will be in all areas of the program, not just testing. And then the eventual outcome will be the program will produce a blueprint for subsequent industry programs document, which will capture all of these lessons learned and be available for future teams that pick up the planning and delivery of programs like this, and all participants engaged in the support of that in the working groups and the governance forums. We wanted to do these sessions whilst testing was still fresh in people's minds. And we also acknowledge that some participant test team members may be rolling off the programme. So we wanted to hold them as soon as we could after we'd concluded CIT, hence these sessions in this week. So we've got 4 one-hour sessions that are planned. This is the first one. We've got another one this afternoon at 4 p.m, one at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and another one at 4 p.m. Tomorrow afternoon. We've loosely structured the session focus. So for today's session, we're going to look at CIT, CIT functional, CIT migration. The reason why we've grouped those 3 together is we did have 2 previous industry retrospective sessions, so we thought it was possible to group those together. Then this afternoon, the session focus will be settlements testing, and then tomorrow morning it will be NFT and PIT. So PIT is obviously a preparatory stage ahead of CIT, but we felt that it was important to talk about how that was approached and the experience that participants had. And then tomorrow afternoon at 4, we'll be looking at CIT ops, environments, defects and release management. Now, in terms of the approach, so as I say, these are 4 one-hour sessions. It's an opportunity for you as participants to provide your views and your experiences on the full CIT life cycle, so that we can pass on any lessons learned, good or bad, onto future programs. So we'd like you to consider both positive and negative experiences. So what went well? It's quite important that anything that you felt worked well for you as a participant, or you felt that the impact was positive to the program, be taken forward by future programs and not be forgotten. And then those things that didn't go so well, in your view, to consider how that impacted you as a participant individually, and how you saw that as impacting the program more broadly, and to consider constructive suggestions on how things could be done differently in those future programs that I'm sure there will be. So the approach to the discussion will be the SI will facilitate these sessions. We'd ask you to be constructive, consider what has been learned and could be passed on to those future teams. The focus areas for each sessions are really loose in structure. So it's our suggestion on the broad focus areas that we could cover in the 4 sessions. But you can raise items from other focus areas in any of the sessions if you would prefer, so that's fine. In terms of meeting admin, if you could just raise your hand in Teams when you want to contribute to the discussion, then we'll come to you one by one. And we'd like you to consider the whole CIT life cycle. And during the discussion, the SI facilitator, either myself or other members of the SI test team, may prompt the discussion on new topics to keep the session flowing. So that could be test cases and data, test process, engagement and communications, test tooling and reporting, and anything just general, just putting it out there at the end if anyone's got anything that they want to throw into the mix. If the conversation reaches a natural conclusion in any given session, we can wrap it up early. But acknowledging that you may go away from the session and consider other things and other topics and items that you want to raise, we will hold each subsequent session in the schedule of 4. And then post the sessions, recordings and transcripts will be published to all attendees. And then a summary of the themes will be played back at the appropriate industry forum, so either GLIG or PSG. And then, as I say, any lessons that are logged will feed into the eventual blueprint for subsequent industry programs document, which I understand will be public. Okay, so on that basis, the sessions are, just as a reminder, are recorded, and we will provide those recordings and transcripts afterwards. So I'm going to open it up to the floor.
And just one point, Dominic, Anup here, if you don't mind. We had a couple of sessions at the election office, if you remember, during the initial phase of CIT, and we did contributed a lot of lessons learned during the initial phase of CIT. So you would be considering them as, of course, we made a lot of changes based on those discussions in the cycle 2, I believe, cycle 2 and 3, based on that. So I hope that will be brought into this session as well, am I right? Because we are considering the entire CIT, am I right, from the beginning till migration. Yeah, just sort of checking that.
So we weren't specifically going to go back over that in terms of the eventual output from these retro sessions. We will include what came out of those original sessions. So obviously, as you refer to the post cycle 1 retro and the post cycle 2 retro, so we'll definitely feed that in. But this is an opportunity for you guys to have a look at it at the end of the process, so and step back in terms of your experiences as participants. So really looking to open up the discussion afresh, really, and looking from start to finish. Anna, hi.
Hi. One thing that did go well, after initial issues with data load, was that when we were using real data and attempting to update that, it was actually better when we took brand new MPANs and then created them in a consistent manner. So that was something that went well. It had improved during the process of during the process of CIT. That improved. So at least we knew that the data itself wasn't going to cause issues, which it had done.
So that was an improvement, sort of organically as we went through, learning from how it was originally approached. Yeah.
Yes.
And so the key thing there was that using more realistic data. Did you say? Is that the?
Well, the problem with realistic data is that there were. I mean, yes, there's always the compromise, isn't there? Whether we use realistic data and then you uncover issues with that data, or whether you use consistent data and then at least you're only testing the functionality, you're proving the functionality rather than proving the data. So in that case, we did have some issues with updating the data so that anomalies came out, and not necessarily in the data, but in the way that the data was amended. So setting them all up in the same way from the start, so they didn't change connection type, they all had the right connection type set up, for example. So that made them very, very, very consistent. Now, the only problem with this, as I say, is that you don't uncover what happens if you change from this to this. You don't uncover those issues, but at least then the functionality could be proven in a consistent manner. So that helped, rather than investigating where data had kind of gone wrong, really.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's one thing that improved during the process. And then also on the opposing side, on a point of data load, really, as we have said many times, data load itself should really have been a separate test phase and should really have been done up front. rather than attempting to change it as we went along. It should have been a separate test phase and should have been isolated rather than attempting to do it during SIT. So that should have been something that was done pre-SIT as just one whole phase.
Ahead of CIT.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, ahead of all.
But ahead of end to end. Yeah. Ahead
of end to end. Yes. Yes. So that was from a data point of view. That's how we feel that in future projects, we feel that data load should be done as a separate, totally separate test phase.
So with a set of kind of criteria that validates that you have the data that you need and it's all correctly set up, and there is a clear success criteria for that before you move forward. Is that what you're suggesting? So,
yes. Yes, because the problem is once you then move because of the way different systems are set up, once you move into SIT, you then have, for example, in MPRS, we have a go live date, so it becomes market-wide half-hourly, so we can't use the existing processes. We can't use all the old processes in certain circumstances by certain suppliers, so things change as you go along. You need it all set up initially to understand how things would work for migration, for example.
Yeah, I'm not challenging your suggestion here, but in terms of the verification and validation of the data that's been set up, how would you seek to do that without having functionality available to do it?
But if the data is set up pre market-wide half-hourly, pre the new functionality, then you can prove it in the old way, in legacy.
Right,
it's legacy data, so you can prove it in a legacy way.
So you would run through some set of legacy regression scenarios or something like that?
Yes, yes, we could. And we felt that there wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough onus on, perhaps that's not the word. There wasn't enough. There wasn't enough time or what's the word? Can't think of the word. Onus on the data setup. It was it was kind of there was obviously a lot of time and effort put into it, but the actual process of loading the data there wasn't enough time for it, and because of the issues encountered.
Right.
So it was not done as well as it could have been, which caused issue during SIT.
Yeah. Okay. So the key suggestion is that we should recommend that there is a structured validation stage, call it a testing stage, whatever you want, specifically on
analysis stage as well.
Analysis, to ensure that the data setup that you have in the environments across the industry is sufficiently well set up that it could avoid data issues down the line in subsequent stages.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that, Anna. Next person with a hand up is Sean. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Ron. Just one from me, linked to Anna. I think with the data upload, the data upload needs to just be consistent, not a changing goalpost. I had a feedback from the metering service team that their goalposts constantly changed with every single test phase and test phase cycle of data upload, and then what MTDs need firing to who, how would the MTDs were being uploaded. There needs to just be a consistent approach, because we were getting limited warning that we'd need to change our systems to upload the data, then fire MTDs at these participants. Oh, actually, we don't need to do that. We're giving you the MTDs to force into your system to then push out. There was a consistent change of approach, definitely on the metering service side, that meant the guys always had to dive into the system or our automated software that we built, that meant that they had to dive in, change it quickly, with, as Anna said, no chance to confirm that it was going to work first time, and then move back.
Mm-hmm. And Sean, did you see that moving from different SIT stages, or was it in between the maintenance periods as well?
So it was it was just a change of approach. So we weren't aware in Cycle 1 that we had to issue MTDs to anyone. Then we sorted that and automated for Cycle 2, and Cycle 3 was fine. But then, sorry, Cycle 3 was different because then you gave us MTDs for Cycle 3 in regression. And then we didn't have to send any MTDs we had to send MTDs for settlements. I've got scribbled somewhere, we didn't have to send MTDs for non-functional. So it was all the different phases had slightly different requirements for metering service. So it was like, I very politely had to go and talk to them to go, you know, this thing you've done that's automated, can you go and tweak it again and again and again?
Okay, and that created confusion, obviously.
Yeah. It was just can we just have one consistent approach from start to finish? So once we've got an automated system we know that works, we're not having to hack it with a couple of days' notice with limited time for development and testing to make sure it's actually doing what it needs to do with the timescales that are being given by the program.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Joe?
Hi, Dom. Yeah, I'm representing Kraken, so we performed a few roles across cohorts A and B. Firstly, we liked the cohort structure, so that enabled plenty of accountability. It enabled supplier-to-supplier testing as well, with change of supplier processes, for example. And the program leads were great. So we had Nikhil and Maya as our program leads, and they were fantastic supports in functional and migration. One thing, though, to be careful of, I think, especially in cycles 1 and 2, we found that the number of daily meetings was really high, especially for us. I mean, it's slightly a Kraken problem because we're across 2 cohorts, but even so, if you account for migration stand-ups, functional stand-ups, joint cohort stand-ups, daily defect meetings, became quite a lot. So we'd suggest next time just having sort of like alternating days maybe, or maybe often doing just ad hoc ones when there was, you know, plenty of content to cover might be a better approach.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting feedback, and it kind of ties into one of the items that I wanted to bring into the discussion, because at the outset of CIT, we were maintaining participant anonymity, and it really drove how we structured things like meetings and ADO, which then meant that we had quite a complex setup in terms of the overhead, as you've mentioned, in terms of the number of meetings, because we needed to maintain that separation, but also in ADO itself, having multiple ADO projects meant that internally it made it more complex and a greater overhead to maintain ADO, but also in terms of transparency and kind of the sharing of the testing position across all cohorts and participants, it just wasn't there. And obviously we made that decision I think it was post cycle 2, wasn't it, to remove that anonymity. I do think that improved the situation, and I would probably recommend future programs actually from the outset don't have an anonymity policy. You have a transparent policy for all participants, and I think, I agree with you in terms of the number of meetings that needed to be held on a daily basis. That was a big overhead. So interesting also what you said in terms of the frequency. Do you think there was enough, you would have got enough value just sort of every other day then?
Probably, yeah. And I think there could have been more room to lean back on just sort of like team posts to communicate certain updates as well. Just a little bit more flexibility would have been helpful.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Joe. Linda, hi.
Hi there. Maybe a little bit of a different angle to the one that Kraken have just made. We found the individual cohort and pair cohort stand-ups very good. A good facilitator, really happy, calm, willing to receive quite difficult messages sometimes, well organised, good MI. And I think I agree there was sometimes too many, but on the whole, I found that those particular, functionally specific stand-ups were actually very good and gave us a lot of good information, specific, and especially the ones that we had for each cohort, the paired cohort and the individual cohort. So without embarrassing the guy involved, I want to say thank you to him. He was very, very good, and his replacements were equally as good. On the other side of it, I found the whole process of descoping across all your functions, I thought that could have been done better. We found it very difficult to get information out of the programme. We would have expected the information to be provided and then the conclusion to be, therefore, we're descoping this. We found it almost seemed to be the other side. They've made a decision and it was reverse engineered. So I think there was an overall, it was really hard to get information out of your testing team. It took weeks, and we found that quite frustrating. That's why we resorted to the stand-ups, because that was the best place to get the information. So I think on the whole, your mailbox monitoring and perhaps it should have been better organised. So that would be sort of the positives and the slightly negatives from ourselves. And I don't think there was sufficient consideration of how the work we had to do to make sure our risk profile, and it was very hard to get that information to really assess that properly because we didn't have that up to hand. We had to come and ask you for that.
Okay. So
thank you.
So yeah, thanks, Linda. Just on the de-scoping side of things, then what would you prefer to see in future in the way that's managed? What would work better for participants, do you think?
Well, I think I tried to explain it, but perhaps not well, is we're descoping this. Here's the reasons why it's not important. Here's the reasons why we think it's not adding too much to your risk. I know you were running out of time. You had to make some decisions. I get that pragmatically, but I think it almost felt that you'd made the decision and then you went to do the justification. We got very worried because we felt the information we were asking for was the information you needed to make those decisions. And when you didn't have it, or it was difficult to get, you might have had it, but you certainly didn't particularly want to share it with us, I felt. It was almost like felt like you were holding back. So I guess an RTTM, here's what we're trying to do, scope. Here's the RTTM that proves to you that the risk isn't there. And therefore, here's what we can, here's what covers that risk elsewhere. And here's why we're going to do this. And I think that, it should have been honest about some of the time constraints that you had and the reasons you did it. So I think all the things we were asking for, we expected to be there. And I think you probably had. It might have just been a difficulty in wanting to share it with us.
Okay. So do you think the answer would be a greater visibility and engagement in the working group on these topics?
No, because I think this is very difficult to raise as a group. We had individual, every participant probably had some of the very same risks in the same order, but some of them probably had different ones. And, nobody particularly wants to share their risks publicly. We've got competitors on the phone as well as, and I know we had, on the whole, we worked very well with our group and our competitor within our peer cohort, but sometimes you just can't say these things. You want to know, and you want to have a more in-depth conversation where you're sharing things with you. And I felt it was really, really hard it was hard. The work group, I don't think it's the forum. You should have had this information
so it's more of a bilateral
hand.
thing.
Yeah, and no, not even a bilateral thing. I think you should have just had a pack. We're descoping. I mean, it was significant, 60, 70 tests. Now, we were thinking, well, why were they in the first place? You must have thought there was value to them when you made the decision. Therefore, descoping them must have been something you had, significant angst over. You must have had a wee pack, or at least a discussion pack that you'd used yourself to make those decisions. Could you please just share that, and then we can have a look at, making sure our risk hasn't changed. So that's really asking what I thought you had existing data for.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have the traceability on that. There were various reasons for descoping decisions. Some of those came through test case defects that were raised, and then that generated another review. There was the rationalization approach as well. There was complexity around the mapping and of the many-to-many mapping of requirements to test cases, which didn't become apparent until test execution commenced, I think. But yeah, I think your point is kind of the more transparency would have been favourable for future programs on that process of decisions that were made. Okay,
yeah,
thanks, Linda.
yeah.
Anoop?
Sure. Hi, Dominic. So I'll start with the topic of DScope, and then I'll touch on the other one. So I think some of the other lessons learned we can take from DScope is obviously doing the right scoping from the beginning, as you rightly said. Understanding the process from different participant perspectives is also important to ensure that we get the test case in the right way from the beginning, because one of the issues that probably you can correct me, one of the concern that was raised from the beginning of the program was the test design wasn't up to the mark, because some of the steps were, but doesn't made any sense for some of the participants because they were not achievable, and that could have led to some of the test cases being descoped because they were never achievable. So that is one lesson learned we can pick up. Whenever we come up with the test design, we have to keep every participants in mind whether it is even achievable or not, so that later when we descope, it is really important that that transparency is given, that okay, this amount of test cases has been descoped because of these reasons. And there has been other instances as well because of the time constraint, as rightly called out by Linda. There were certain test cases that were initially marked as deferred, where it's mentioned that okay, we are deferring it from CIT functional and migration, and it will be taken care by some other test phase, for example, operational. But when we reached that stage, we were again told that okay, these are getting we revisited it, and there is no point in running it now. So what's happening is that we keep changing the goalpost, even in terms of the descoping, which basically creates an uncertainty in our mind, say that okay, are we doing the right thing? Are we covering having the right coverage? So that's where we need to have the clarity in terms of descoping, and it is really important. When I know that when we started the program, we had a very exhaustive list of test cases to ensure that we have had maximum coverage, but because of the time constraints, because of the issues we had to revisit them, and we wanted to ensure that the scope was actually focusing on the main objective rather than doing exhaustive testing, which is absolutely fine. But what that creates the doubt in our mind is that are we losing on something else? Are we going to see more issues in production? So the lessons learned for future programs would be that the scoping should be, I mean, I'm pretty much sure we can't get it on spot on, but at least we should ensure that the test design part of it needs to consider how the current production estate for all the participants work, so that it is aligned according to it, rather than it being getting descoped, or even when we pick up something for test execution, that's when we realize, oh, we can't execute it because it's not even viable. So that's one lesson learned which we can take up from descoping the scenario. One is the transparency. Second one is even if we are deferring it or descoping, we need to get that clarity whether it is being deferred or whether it is getting descoped really. So that's
Okay.
one idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we just hold on this point before you got other items you want to talk about as well?
Yeah. So
okay. So if we can just hold on this point and just step back a little bit as a group. So if you consider the design, it's pretty huge. It covers all of the electricity industry. The way the design was constructed did assume a certain amount of industry knowledge within each participant. I think as you feed that through into the process of creating test cases and pitching those test cases at the right level, where they're not completely prescriptive, because they can't be, because we don't know everybody's system, and nor should we, but also that they are at a level that we can validate the requirements in the design. There was obviously the industry review process on those test cases. And what we all saw when we went into the execution was obviously we had a high volume of test case defects. I think something like a quarter of all defects raised were against the test cases themselves. And I'd be interested to explore what participants feel could have been done in the review process of the test collateral itself in order to try and improve that situation.
From a St. Clement's point of view, I believe we reviewed them and our updates were not included. Not all our updates were included. I wasn't party to that review process, but that's what I understand. So I think that perhaps more time should have been. The problem is there have been times during this process where there is not enough time for the review process. So there's only something sent out. There is not enough time. People send back comments. There is not enough time after those comments to allow for a second review process because there's a lot of change. So there is that is a lesson learned, that there needs to be more time given for the review process.
Underestimate that process of review. Yeah. So build in sufficient time and multiple cycles. Possibly from what you're saying. Yeah.
I remember during, I mean, obviously faster switching is an old project, but I remember having to review something 7 times in the end just to get it right. I think it was the test cases to ensure that they were correct. And obviously that is a huge overhead, but and obviously 7 times is excessive, but I think that more than once is important.
So I was in a participant organisation on that programme, but for those of you that were kind of in more central roles, did you perceive that there was less test case issues as a consequence of the more review?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Dom, can I just come in on the descoping thing to address Linda and Anna's comments around transparency? So what we tried to do, I think, from cycle 3 onwards was actually to address the kind of transparency around descoping, and in particular around why we're descoping and where the risks are, especially in terms of coverage. So the process around that was we would come up with a proposal document that, after internal review, would go to code bodies, and they would look at that and see the impact on qualification and other areas. And then it would go through papers to CIT working group and then CITAG. And then once it was approved there, we would create or we would update a single document with all the test cases that were descoped. And that was the scope traceability document that was published on the collaboration base and then mentioned in the clock. So there would be a proposal process. We're proposing to descope this. These are the reasons why. These are justifications. This is the gaps in coverage, or this is where we've got coverage covered. And then it will go into that single document. So what I'm asking for is, did that not land correctly? Did that not hit the right audience? Was that something you were aware of or not aware of? Because that seems to me to address the points you've raised. But if it didn't get to the right people, then clearly we've got something to address there in future programs.
And it's not just getting to the people. So we did give the initial information in terms of what is getting descoped and all. There were a few things which were missing. For example, the traceability was missing initially in terms of what is getting impacted and what's the impact of these descopes. That came at the later part of the stage, if I'm not wrong. And the second thing is, even after we got that mapping, we had certain scenarios which we felt that hanging around, which we think wasn't feeling right. And we did, I mean, if I talk from a British Gas perspective, we did drop a couple of emails asking for clarity on this list of test cases. This has been deferred initially. Are we getting descoped? If so, why is it getting descoped? And can we get the rationale for that? And I definitely recollected we have sent it multiple times, post which we got one response in terms of saying that this is being descoped because we are not going to pursue that any further with operations because of so and so reason. So as I said, initially we have been told it is getting descoped. We were worried why a lot of scenarios are getting descoped. Then later we got a bit of rationale for certain list of scenarios, including the mapping with the requirements. And then there was certain things which were not fitting within that group, for which we wanted to ask clarity. So there were a lot of back and forth in terms of this descoping, rather than having it once and all with all the details being published. So that's what we want to see in the future programs, that if we are going to list a list of scenarios for descoping, we have to come with the rationale plus the impact associated with that, if at all, so that will give more assurance to the participants who are part of the program that, okay, fine, it is being descoped for so and so reasons, so we don't have to worry about that in production. That's the angle at which we are coming on.
Yeah, I also think some of the bodies have got, their prioritizations weren't always the same as some of the participants. So, and I'll give you an example. I'm not saying this was true or not, but obviously this crossed people's minds. Timelines were very important, but for the people that have to deal with some of the decisions that could have been made to reach those timelines, for the people who've got to support something that might be a little bit flaky in life, we obviously have got a greater degree of interest in quality and a greater degree of interest in making sure that the results and the tests are thorough, then perhaps people who are more motivated by making sure the times are and the milestones are hit. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that I don't think some of the decisions were always made with the consequences passed down to somebody who wasn't there. And I think that I felt that sometimes the decisions were made and we never got sufficient communication about why these decisions were made. And I think probably there was lots of discussion about the impact it had on the people that were involved, but we never got that information. So we had to maybe in the background think things that weren't true. But I'm saying I don't think all the parties that made those decisions were subject to the consequences, and that's, I think, important.
So the answer from your perspective, in terms of your experience of this, would have been more consultation at a participant level. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I'm not even saying more talk. I'm saying give us the MI, because talk is, we can all we all maybe have different views, and there's people on this call may have different views from me. All I ever wanted was the same MI you had that you must have used to make the proper decisions. We didn't get that. I don't feel we got that. If you'd have just sent the pack over, we could have scrutinised it and made our own decisions. But I think they were almost like the decision was made. And as Anoop said, we said, well, why has it been descoped? And yeah, don't worry, it'll be all right on the night. That really wasn't good enough at some points. Even though it might have been the right decision, that isn't good enough. We need to know the sort of detail when you're at a level of actually going to be supporting it in a go live situation. We were really much more interested in a lot more detail. And I don't think your recos and some of these other bodies would have been either knowledgeable enough to make the decisions based on that detail or necessarily interested in that level of detail. It's a bit paternalistic, a bit sorry, parochial, not paternalistic, a bit parochial. And I just felt that we should have been at the table as well.
Okay, so it is more consultation required in those decisions then, isn't it? A broader consultation, I think, is what you're saying. I'm just trying to think what we would recommend in a future program, given these circumstances. So obviously, if you consider the full life cycle of the creation of the test cases and the review process, but then also any decisions that are made to descope it, what I'm hearing here is that there could have been better visibility and consultation with a broader group in order to feel more confident as that broader group that the decisions being made were right. And the only way to do that
with the MI, I know you had to make a call because you couldn't have a big union mass meeting every time you wanted to do something. I got all that, but I think if you'd have provided more of the reason, the trail of how you got to that conclusion, I think you didn't necessarily have to consult us and everything, and that would have stalled everything. I get that. It's too. It was if you'd have provided the reasons in a more detail and a closer point to where the decision was being made. Sometimes we were getting the information long after you'd have the working group and you'd made the decision, and we thought, well, what's the point?
And was this a situation that you saw improve over time? Because to Salman's point there, I think there was that traceability through the governance framework. But was it something that you saw as a problem more earlier on, or did you see it improve as we went through?
No, I didn't see it improve. I thought it was better at the beginning, to be honest. I thought we were more involved at the beginning. I think the pressure of time was against us. I think it got worse, actually. Because your people dropped off. You had less people visible. There was more of the same faces. There was less of the sort of functional people. I think you were downsizing as well. So I think there was more pressure on your people as things progressed. I certainly felt
that wasn't the case, actually.
Yeah. It just felt a little bit that you were dropping people and losing people, and Adrian and Lee and everything else. There was some quite key people that left. And whether that's pure coincidence, Dominic, and you said that wasn't happening, that's fine. It just felt a little bit that there was less people doing more. And, we're sensitive people to that as well, that you were under pressure too.
Okay. So Linda, can I just ask, did you get visibility then of the proposals to descope?
Yes, we did, but I think it felt like the decision had already been made. That was the point. Here's what we're going to do, and here's. I felt that the decisions had always been made, and we were just being sold it rather than consulted on it.
Right. Okay. I get your point. So actually, at that point, the decisions are not made until CIT advisory group would give the thumbs up on it. So that they were actually proposals, but maybe that message didn't land, and it was presumed that it was a decision made. I think, yeah. Okay. I take the point. Thanks.
Okay. Conscious there are other hands up, but Anoop, you had something else you wanted to raise?
Just one more point. In connection with that, I think Anna did mention about the test data. I think one approach which might have went wrong, and probably we are getting it corrected as part of the QT, is the way we started with the test data preparation. We kept the migrations towards the end, obviously, because migrations were not ready at the beginning. So in the future program, especially where we are introducing a brand new functionality, obviously the test data has to be manipulated in the beginning. I reckon we have to have a program where the initial part should be ready first, which is the migration, so that we create the data in the right way, so that we don't mess up with the data in the first place, and then we face a lot of issues getting it corrected and losing on time. So I think that should be the biggest lesson learned for this program, where we need to start with how we should have started in if we would have done it in production, like starting with migration. So just wanted to add that point as well.
As you recall, that was the intent at the beginning. Obviously, delivery decisions had to be made in the face of those elements not being ready at the time that we originally expected. Hence why we ended up going down that road. But it was a compromise, and I do agree with you. It's something that should be noted for future programs. Okay, next hand up is Joe again. Hi, Joe.
Hi, thanks, Dom. Just want to move on on a couple of points around the test process and the engagement and comms topics. This is on behalf of IMServe. We were testing in cohorts E and F. Just on the point of what went well, I think if we cast our minds back to CIT, I thought there were a couple of good things. We thought there were a couple of good things there around the CIT intervals that you introduced. So having that staggered approach to execution, where we had a phased introduction to the actual testing, was a good idea, because it wasn't a big bang of everybody trying to do everything on day one or all at the same time. And similarly with the engagement that you had with participants early, that was a good thing. Those day in the life sessions that you ran were useful. They provided a lot of clarity to PPs in terms of what does a typical day look like, and how you want us to engage with the program. I know we had those sessions repeated for future phases rather. So we had one with CIT where it was all kind of stepped through, but then in some of the later phases, those sessions were repeated, but elements were skipped, and there was a bit of an assumption that everybody on the call had already been involved. So, later phases, perhaps there were an increased test team size, and there were new joiners who perhaps hadn't seen that previous content or hadn't been involved in the same level of depth as perhaps the CIT sessions had taken us through. So some of it was skipped, and perhaps an inference that the context was already
not
there.
Assume the continuity of teams. So
yes,
go back to the full basics and repeat. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And I think in terms of CIT, when we moved into the cohort structure, I think the cohort coordination and the management of the tests, as has already been touched on, was good. It was smooth. The transition in terms of execution between participants, assignees in DevOps, and the structure of test cases and the states of execution was managed quite well. And again, obviously the coordinators played a pivotal role in that, so that was good. In terms of some of the items around not going so well, again around the test data that Anna and Jordan and others have spoken about on this call, I think we need to echo those points. One of the key things in the data load that's not yet been mentioned is actually around the issuance of those revisions and amendments to data. So we would receive communication that version 1 of the data has been loaded into the SFTP, and then subsequent versions, there wouldn't necessarily be comms on every update. So we might drill in a couple of days later and see, oh, it's at version 7. but we've loaded version 1, and then there's a delta, and then what's the difference? And having to unpick all of that was quite difficult for us in terms of loading into our systems. So I think that the improvement point we wanted to make there was for comms to be issued on every update of data, not just the initial. There's some data to go and extract out of the SFTP area.
So the version comms on the data, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so the version control was there. It's more the communication wrapper
comms,
around
yeah.
it, that was missing. A similar point on communication. Again, Linda, you raised earlier around the testing mailbox and the slow turnarounds. We felt the same. Lots of having to chase or no responses coming back out of that, and being pointed to that was fine, but not when we weren't getting the bilateral communication from the mailbox. So I think an improvement point on that area as well. And just finally on the assurance activity that's been happening recently, perhaps other participants are also receiving a similar assurance queries coming back through on items that perhaps were run a long time ago. So for example, we received a couple of queries on Sprint 4.1 and 4.2 in July of this year, but of course we executed those 12 months ago. So I think it would have been a lot more efficient if those assurance results were shared and that assurance was conducted along the way when execution was fresh in people's minds, perhaps rather than doing it as a big bang activity at the end. Because again, we've had to go back and remind ourselves, what did we do on that particular test in that particular step 12 months ago? So, yeah, a bit of a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, okay. So more real time or well, obviously there's always going to be a natural lag, but closer to the actual execution. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, where those test cases were passed and required evidence, be beneficial to do that cursory check and that assurance at that stage before the test is declared passed, and make sure all the evidence is there and that the assurance is complete on that, so we can move forward and not have to retrospectively look at really old stuff, especially.
Yeah. All right, Joe, thanks.
Thank
That's
you.
really useful. Thank you. Richard, hi.
Hi, Dom. Just a couple of bits I wanted to touch on based on what some other people have said. You talked about the reviewing of the test cases when they were first coming out.
Yeah.
Personally, I found them being in ADO brought them to life. They were much easier to review in that format for me. And sometimes they were quite close to the start date of going into ADO. I appreciate that doesn't mean we didn't have a chance to review the sort of Excel type documents, but if there were an option, a preference for getting them into that neater and for me easier to read format would have been helpful and would have therefore hopefully reduced the number of defects.
Yeah, I guess from a program perspective, I remember being there at the time, sort of trying to balance the change of the test cases that was coming out of the review before loading them. But you're saying you actually felt it was easier to work with the script once it was in the tool, and that's not necessarily something that the program considered. So that's interesting feedback.
And yeah, appreciate everybody may not be the same, but that was certainly my preference anyway, doing it that way. And I think equally at the very beginning, if you go back to functional cycle 1 as well, whilst we were still getting used to everything starting and starting to read and understand test cases, naturally that for me just became the way to review them as we move forward. Changing the subject, but based on something Joe Kraken mentioned at the beginning of the call on the volume of sort of daily calls or Teams meetings or things like that. Generally, I agree with those comments that were made, but we did find at stages in testing when you're relying on other participants that sometimes people weren't around unexpectedly on occasion. And I would just sort of caveat any reduction of calls with it was using that was an opportunity to check in with people as well, or for the coordinators to realise if people might not be around, which could have impacted ability to run certain test cases. Generally, obviously, where we were all working together really well and the team chats were working and you could get hold of each other. But yeah, I think you take my point. Just at times it was difficult to get hold of certain participants.
Yeah.
In certain test cases, particularly when it came to cross cohort. type activities.
I mean, I think we definitely felt the overhead of having so many meetings centrally, but obviously we're trying to balance a drumbeat, aren't we, and everyone checking in regularly, because you don't know what's going to be raised on any given day by a member of the cohort, for instance, that is going to have an impact on everyone else. So we felt that the frequency, at least daily, for the main cohort and the paired cohort was probably safest to enable that, that potential, or to avoid any potential lag in communication. I think what you're saying as well was it was good in terms of identifying when people weren't going to be around, and that could have an impact as well. So yeah,
and also when people weren't around unexpectedly as well, or when they were meant to be on some tests that had specific timescales on them, and then things weren't occurring. I think that probably more helped the coordinators then start to know where they might need to give some support or attention.
Okay, all right, thank you for that, Richard. Sean?
Yeah, just rolling back to a couple of points Anna made with the test case review. I remember being in a set working group and we were given an additional week to do the initial review due to the number of tests. But again, it's just reiterating that fact that there were still so many test case defects, because myself, and I'm aware that a couple of other participants in our link cohorts did the same. We had to block out and go, right, in version 1, I'm not involved in these tests, therefore when version 2 came out, I don't need to review them. But so many changes had happened, I missed a load of changes done in those test cases, because I'd looked in the initial run and gone, right, as a metering service or as a supplier, I'm not involved in this test, therefore. So yeah, it was more. It's
but
just
then
reiterating.
In the next version, we could have changed who was involved in the test case. Is that you're right? Okay, understood.
I've made that point for the later call in settlements, because in settlements version 1, supplier was barely involved.
Yeah.
And then version 3 came out, and we were literally doing all the reviews of all the steps. Therefore, I was like, But yeah, it's the same going all the way through. I'm aware, like steps were put in advance where it was saying the smart metering service has to do a step in an advanced segment. I missed that because it's not for me to review, because I was doing it for a different participant that's not in that segment. So it's a query of, also with that error, do you guys need more time to review your tests before the release to us to remove those mistakes, or and then we also definitely needed more time and more reviews.
So it sounds like the key takeaway, and I think we'd share the view as well, is just don't underestimate the amount of review time needed on the test cases, and build that into your plan, ensuring that you've got sufficient time for internal review before it goes to industry, and then expect iterations of that review. But I think another point you were making there is that from version to version, the comms around that's quite important, because in the earlier stages of review, there might be more flux on those test cases. And whilst you might have looked at the original version, if it's changed to a significant degree, you need to be aware of that. And so that summary of the change possibly is something that could help the process in future.
Definitely.
Okay.
And one final one on the test cases, a call out from one of my colleagues, is that some of the test cases were overly complex and too long. Therefore, you're well aware of, we were getting to the right at the end, and then there was a defect, and we'd have to do 150 steps of a test again just to get to that point. So is there a potential of breaking the tests down to more sizable chunks as a precursor, so we don't have to run 200-step tests over and over again through defects, because that was just causing a lot of pain. So that's just a final thing for me.
So just make them more component based, or somehow. I mean, I think we all agree that there was some pretty hefty test cases in there with a lot of test cases, which I think you know, in reality, when you come to execution, is unwieldy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anna?
Hi, yes. Following on from several comments from Joe Melville's about evidence. Obviously, during testing, we noticed there was inconsistencies in what evidence was requested. So there was a spreadsheet that said some test cases needed evidence and then the ADO said another thing. So there were certain bits of evidence that were missing there because our colleagues used one set rather than the other set. And this caused, now they're asking for the evidence 12 months down the line, there's quite a lot of evidence required, but in fact it wasn't. If there had been time been allowed to get those consistent, that wouldn't have been a problem. There's also the fact that the migration design was not complete before we started CIT. As Anoop says, there again, that's another issue. And our biggest problem, our biggest lessons learned is to allow more time, because due to lack of time, due to rushing into CIT before everything was in place. I understand everybody's trying to do Agile, but is Agile really a relevant within a program of this size? Agile should really be used in much smaller projects rather than huge programs of work. But everything was rushed to get into CIT, so the design wasn't complete. The test cases weren't reviewed sufficiently. The evidence requirements weren't specified. The testing reporting requirements changed. That's another lessons learned. The testing reporting requirements changed during the process from cycle to cycle. So it was very difficult, especially for us as we have to provide to our customers how things are going, and we were unable to do that. So those requirements were not worked out at the beginning. The resource required, the day in the life, yes, that was very good and was given, but it was only a couple of days before CIT started. So we were unclear of what was required before CIT started. Training and knowledge transfer. So the coordinators, there again, very good, but they learned as they went along. They weren't clear. St. Clement's ended up answering a lot of design questions, a lot of questions about test cases, which it's not just our design, it's the design, it was there, but people were not clear where to find the information from. And then obviously defect raising and test cases, the decision to keep them separate, all the cohorts. So these things were changed as they went along, which helped, but perhaps more time should have been spent at the beginning, pre-CIT starting. I believe CIT started too quickly, too early in the process. Things should have been allowed to finish, to be in place before CIT started. There was, we were told, we gave a timescale of how long it would take to develop and deliver code, and we were not given the length of time that we required. And then there again, as with every project this happens with, the time ends up being used up anyway. Whereas if we'd have all, more haste, less speed and all that sort of thing, if we'd have been allowed to have the correct time to get all our ducks in a row prior to starting CIT, there would have been a lot less issues. CIT would have been over a lot quicker. So it is there again, the test case review, there wouldn't have been as many descopes if people had been allowed the chance to review. So I believe that the largest lesson learned is to allow the time to listen to the participants, to listen to the central parties when they say this will take this long, and to get all ducks in a row before starting CIT, because CIT is such a huge area. We're all bobbing around in the water rather than actually swimming in the right direction.
Okay, so it sounds to me like your perception and your experience from your participant organization was that given more time, we would have had more stability, we would have had better outcomes essentially, and that
and potentially would have finished earlier.
We should recommend future programs be more realistic about the time allowed to prepare.
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Time allowed to prepare and a better detailed plan in place to obviously there was a detailed plan in place, but it didn't cover it. There was a lot of unknowns as we went into CIT, and those unknowns should have been known at that point. There was a lot more that should have been known, and I think that the timescales would have been more realistic. CIT wouldn't have been as painful as it was.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Just conscious of time, and Fiona, have you got some quick points, or do you want to pick it up on the next call?
They'll just be quick, Dom, I think.
Yep.
I kind of sit halfway with what Anna's saying and what happened. You know, when we first started testing, it was a bit of a free-for-all, and I think it did need some agile processes put in place into the sprints in order to give focus for each of the cohorts in smaller chunks, which is what agile is all about. I think if we carried on as we were, we would never finish the testing. It's just like, you know, pick what you want to run. So I think the agile principles were great to bring in. So although we didn't run an agile way of working in delivery and testing, agile definitely needed to be part of what was in there. And thinking about what people are saying on the reviews, you're never going to pick everything up on the reviews, and only by starting and working your way through do you actually understand where the problems are. So I think we did start at the right time. I think maybe the approach we took in it being a bit of a free-for-all to begin with didn't work, and if we'd have done agile and smaller chunks to begin with, it would have been okay. And I think, you know, we finished it probably in the time it would have taken in the end. Maybe not the approach that would have, you know, could have been done, but there are such a lot of tests to run, and they were so long, some of them, and nobody's going to get that right, and you're always going to get test case discrepancies, and you only understand them when you run them. So more reviews maybe, but will you find everything? No, you'll never find everything. So, you know, execution is the only way that you'll get to the bottom of what there is.
I think that there's this constant balance, isn't there, between kind of like, take for instance the difference in approach from cycle one, where, you know, it was resting upon participants within the cohorts kind of self-managed, but actually as we learned from the first retro that balance wasn't quite right, and then it needed to be more of a direction. You know, with some more review time, maybe we would have got less test case defects, but I think at the same on the other side of the coin, I think you're right. Until you actually start running something, you may not necessarily see it in the right way. And therefore you'll still get the defect out. So it's sort of about finding the balance, isn't it? I think.
Exactly. And, you know, and I think in the end, after the first few months, we all came to that balance, you know, within our own cohorts. We found a way of working. And also some of these cohorts, the people have never worked together. You know, as Linda said, you are working with people who are your competitors in the area. You've got to find a balance. I mean, from our cohort, I had brand new people who never all worked together, and you have to find ways for those people all to work together, get to understand each other, and, you know, and actually become friends with each other and be able to talk at the end of the day. And if you don't have that, you don't have a cohort that can work together, and that took time as well. And that was always going. I don't think that was even considered, you know, as part of you know, the journey in finding that balance with everybody in the cohort.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that was considered. I think we had some pre-meets, didn't we?
We did,
to try and get people introduced. But I think naturally, as human beings, everyone needs to just start to work together, don't they, to sort of learn how to manage those relationships. And that can happen in differing speeds within different groups of people, and it's nothing to do with, you know, the difference in people. It's just that they are different groups with different dynamics that need to establish. And so, you know, I think you naturally see this on testing programs and testing projects, don't you, where at first the throughput is slower as test analysts and test teams get to grips with what they're working with. But obviously you start to see the throughput increase just naturally and organically as teams get to know the system and get to know working with each other. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Dom. I think the target initially was too big. The first target should have been quite small to get everybody in, and everybody was very had to step back and think, we were like 10%, I think the most anybody passed in that first target was 10%. And I think setting a small target to begin with gives people more confidence, because I think the confidence was kind of not to begin with.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It was hard to demonstrate the progress when, I think, as testing teams, we all knew that was quite natural. But stakeholders and possibly people who aren't in testing professional roles were getting spooked by what was perceived to be a lack of progress, when actually it was probably realistic.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious that we've gone over, but we do have the session, the second session at 4 p.m. today. So if there's anything that you haven't brought up in the session this morning that you wanted to discuss, then please just bring it up straight away at the beginning of the next session. We'll try and steer the conversation to focus a bit more on settlement later, but it is going to be broad. You can jump in with any observations or experiences that you want to bring into the discussion. So really great session. Look forward to speaking to you again in the next one at 4. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers.